Shocking photos from World War II. You must see. Historical photos. Imagine living in a world where the sky could suddenly erupt in fire, where children practiced putting on gas masks at school, and where the threat of invisible poisons was part of daily life. What was it like to grow up during one of history's most dangerous times? Welcome to the History and Focus channel. If stories like this intrigue you, don't forget to subscribe. We've got plenty more to explore. Let's rewind to August 9th, 1945. Over the city of Nagasaki, a massive mushroom cloud rose more than 11 miles into the sky. The bomb, ominously nicknamed Fat Man, unleashed the force of 21,000 tons of TNT, leaving devastation in its wake. The consequences were unimaginable, both immediate and long-lasting. Meanwhile, in Nazi Germany, a darker kind of horror unfolded behind closed doors. Dr. Klaus Karl Schilling conducted brutal experiments on more than 200 prisoners at the Dachau concentration camp. His so-called malaria research brought immense suffering and death, leading to his conviction for war crimes in 1946. Back in wartime Britain, everyday citizens lived in fear of chemical attacks. In Kingston, London, schoolchildren routinely took part in evacuation drills, wearing gas masks as a normal part of their routine. So here's a question to ponder. If you were a child during World War II, how would you have coped with air raid sirens, gas masks, and constant uncertainty? History isn't just about dates, it's about people, fear, resilience, and choices. Stick around as we dive deeper into stories that shaped the world. 1. Unyielding moments of World War II. A glimpse through lens and legacy. In the annals of World War II, some of the most haunting moments were captured not just in military records, but in photographs that froze the human cost of global conflict. One such image shows Leonard Seifel, an Australian radio operator, moments before his execution on Etched Beach in Papua New Guinea in 1943. This powerful photograph was later discovered in the possession of a deceased Japanese officer, offering a raw testament to the war's brutality and the personal sacrifices made on distant battlefields. Elsewhere in September 1941, 5 Soviet civilians stood beneath the weight of nooses around their necks near the town of Valga. These individuals were victims of the Nazi regime's systematic terror policy. The public executions were not only acts of violence, but instruments of fear, designed to dominate the occupied populations and deter resistance by showcasing the harsh consequences of defiance. The war's reach extended far beyond the front lines. In London, civilians endured nightly bombings during the Blitz, where warning sirens often offered little time for retreat. A photograph of a London bus, its passengers tragically caught without access to a shelter during one such bombing, reveals the indiscriminate nature of aerial warfare. These attacks targeted not only infrastructure, but morale, leaving ordinary people vulnerable amid the chaos. In North Africa during the spring of 1940, Italian forces deployed flamethrowers near the Egyptian border. These weapons, although terrifying, were tactically significant in both open confrontations and siege warfare. Their effectiveness lay in flushing out entrenched positions, incinerating defenses, and psychologically breaking enemy troops. Operating in arid and rugged terrain, flamethrower units supported broader strategies to dominate key desert strongholds. Turning to Western Europe, the scale of Allied operations reached its zenith on June 6, 1944, with the D-Day landings in Normandy. The aerial imagery from that day captures just a sliver of the immense military machinery in motion. Thousands of ships, aircraft, and soldiers converging on fortified beaches. This unprecedented amphibious assault marked a turning point in the war, forming the spearhead for liberating Nazi-occupied Europe. Later in 1944, Operation Market Garden saw Allied paratroopers descending upon the Netherlands in an ambitious attempt to seize critical bridges for a rapid push into Germany. Despite its boldness and early promise, the mission ultimately faltered due to underestimated German resistance and logistical failures. It stands as one of the most significant Allied setbacks on the Western Front, underscoring the unpredictability of warfare, even with detailed planning. Meanwhile, over Eastern Europe, B-24 Liberator bombers streaked toward their target in Ploiești, Romania. The oil refineries there were crucial to the German war effort, supplying the Axis with much-needed fuel. The mission, although heavily defended and fraught with danger, succeeded in blanketing the area with bombs, as plumes of smoke blanketed the sky, visual evidence of the damage inflicted despite formidable anti-aircraft fire. In the frigid waters of the Polar Sea in 1942, a German U-boat cut through icy currents, isolated yet deadly. These submarines played a pivotal role in the Battle of the Atlantic, attacking Allied convoys to disrupt supply chains. Operating under extreme environmental conditions, U-boat crews endured long, perilous missions that contributed significantly to the maritime theater of war. Lastly, the strategic ingenuity of the Allies was on display off the coast of Normandy. 13 Liberty ships were deliberately sunk to create a makeshift breakwater, part of an artificial harbor system known as the Mulberry Harbors. These submerged vessels formed a protective barrier, allowing the safe unloading of troops, vehicles, and materials essential to sustaining the momentum of the invasion and ensuring a steady flow of reinforcements. These fragments of history, each frozen in image and memory, are more than mere records. They are enduring reminders of the resilience, strategy, suffering, and complexity that defined the global conflict of World War II. Through them, the scale and humanity of the war become starkly real, echoing through generations as both cautionary tales and tributes to those who endured. 2. Shadows of War, a glimpse into the human cost of World War II. In the blistering heat of July 1943, off the coast of Gela, Sicily, the thunder of war reached a deafening climax. An American supply ship, heavily laden with ammunition vital for the Allied invasion, was struck by a German bomb. In an instant, a colossal explosion tore through the vessel, scattering debris across the sea. The fiery blast illuminated the sky, serving as a grim reminder of the peril that shadowed every supply line in amphibious operations. It wasn't just soldiers on the front who risked their lives. Those behind the scenes, aboard unarmed cargo ships, faced death from above with every mission. 2 years later, in March 1945, the skies above the German city of Bohalt were thick with smoke as the Royal Air Force unleashed a devastating bombing campaign. Over 150 tons of explosives rained down on the city, obliterating nearly 80% of its structures. The destruction targeted critical infrastructure vital to the Nazi war machine, but the human cost was staggering. Streets were reduced to rubble, lives extinguished in an instant. What once bustled with daily life became a smoldering ghost of its former self. In Nazi-occupied Poland, the horrors of the Holocaust reached some of their darkest moments. Jewish children from the Łódź ghetto were rounded up, separated from their families under the cold eye of Nazi command. Their destination, the Chelmno extermination camp. They were too young to understand the weight of what was happening, but their silent tears echoed one of history's cruelest tragedies. Thousands were sent to their deaths, children whose lives, full of potential, were cut short in a system built on hatred. Across the border in France, a French soldier stood before a haunting sight at the Natzweiler Struthof concentration camp. A mountain of shoes, the last trace of thousands of souls lost to Nazi brutality, lay abandoned near the crematorium. This was the only concentration camp built on French soil, and by the time it was liberated in 1944, it had witnessed unspeakable suffering. Each shoe was a silent testament to a life erased. Meanwhile, high above the Netherlands in September 1944, American paratroopers hurled themselves from aircraft during Operation Market Garden. The mission aimed to secure key bridges and cut deep into German-occupied territory. But what was meant to be a swift victory met fierce resistance. The skies and fields turned red as the Allies endured devastating losses. Hopes of a breakthrough faded into the marshy soil, and yet the courage of those who leapt into uncertainty was immortal. Thousands of miles away, the black sands of Iwo Jima bore witness to one of the bloodiest battles of the Pacific theater. Nearly 70,000 U.S. Marines faced off against 21,000 entrenched Japanese defenders. The island's volcanic terrain turned every inch forward into a nightmare. Over 26,000 American casualties were recorded in just 36 days. The price of victory was steep, etched in each crater and every battered bunker. In May 1942, the USS Lexington, a proud American aircraft carrier, became a blazing inferno in the Coral Sea. Hit by waves of Japanese torpedoes and bombs, her crew fought desperately to save her. As flames engulfed the deck, crew members evacuated into the sea. Nearby destroyers plucked survivors from the water, while the USS Phelps delivered the final blow, scuttling the Lexington to prevent her capture. The once mighty warship vanished beneath the waves, a symbol of sacrifice and resilience. In the city of Bryansk, Russia, a young recruit embraced his family one last time before heading to the front. In 1943, millions were conscripted across the Soviet Union. These farewells were soaked with emotion. Mothers, clutching sons, wives, grasping hands they might never hold again. The Eastern Front promised nothing but ferocity. Many of these men would never return. Finally, on the morning of December 7, 1941, the U.S. battleships West Virginia and Tennessee burned at Pearl Harbor. The surprise Japanese attack plunged America into war. West Virginia took multiple torpedoes and bombs, while Tennessee, partly shielded by her sister ship, still caught fire. Elsewhere, Japanese pilots received final instructions for the assault, believing the blow would cripple U.S. power in the Pacific. But they miscalculated. The attack awakened a sleeping giant, galvanizing a nation into action and reshaping the fate of the world. These moments, spread across continents and oceans, represent more than military strategy or statistics. They are echoes of human endurance, tragedy, and defiance in the face of unimaginable adversity. The cost of World War II was more than just territory or politics. It was measured in lives, in heartbreak, and in the hope that such horrors never return. 3. Echoes of war, shadows in the sky, and sorrows at sea. In the dim corridors of memory where smoke lingers and silence falls heavy, the Pacific skies of the 1940s become a theater of fire, fear, and finality. Across the vast ocean, streaks of silver tore through clouds, bringing both destruction and deliverance. This is not merely a recounting of historical milestones. It is a meditation on moments that cracked the sky and reshaped human destiny. In 1944, amid the rustling jungle of Buru Island, The air shimmered with tension as parabomb clusters plummeted toward a well-camouflaged Japanese bomber on the old Namlea airfield. The United States 5th Air Force had launched a coordinated assault with a singular objective: to cripple the heart of Japanese aerial strength in the Dutch East Indies. Each descending bomb was not just a payload, but a whisper of strategy and a scream of resolve. This calculated destruction sought to pave the way for the Allied advance by dismantling enemy infrastructure that had long anchored Japan's regional dominance. A year earlier, in July 1943, 2 American A-20 Havoc light bombers thundered across the skies over Kokos, Indonesia. Their mission was precise: neutralize key Japanese targets in this strategic outpost. The air was thick with tracer fire, and as one of the aircraft released its deadly cargo, it was struck by anti-aircraft artillery. Flames curled along its fuselage as it spiraled into the sea below. Moments like this reflected the duality of air warfare: clinical from above, yet tragic in execution. The sea became a graveyard for many, its waves swallowing wreckage and lives alike. In the aftermath of such loss, the USS Hansford bore witness to one of the most solemn rituals of war: a burial at sea. Draped in reverence and silence, the ceremony honored a fallen serviceman from the Iwo campaign, a brutal episode marked by unrelenting ground combat and relentless attrition. As the body slipped beneath the water's surface, so too did a fragment of a generation's innocence. These ceremonies, though brief, formed vital spiritual bridges for grieving comrades who had no time or place for traditional mourning. From above, the chaos of naval warfare presented an entirely different visage. A U.S. Navy photographer, circling high above the fray, captured haunting imagery of a Japanese Mohammed-class heavy cruiser during the pivotal Battle of Midway. Its hull was ruptured, its decks a twisted labyrinth of iron and smoke. The once formidable war machine was now a splintered shadow of itself, illustrating the sheer intensity and effectiveness of Allied precision bombing. Nearby, the Japanese aircraft carrier Hiryu danced across the waves, weaving through the falling steel rain of B-17 Flying Fortress bombs. The pilots of the United States Army Air Forces, perched miles above, could only watch and hope their efforts found their mark. Though initially escaping direct hits, Hiryu would later succumb to compounded damage, marking a critical blow to the Japanese fleet. The Battle of Midway signified not only a turning point in naval supremacy, but also a psychological fracture in Japan's maritime ambitions. Yet beyond the mechanical destruction of metal and mortar, war's most indelible scars were etched upon human flesh and spirit. Following the catastrophic fall of Singapore in 1942, Allied prisoners of war, primarily British troops, were subjected to a purgatory of starvation, disease, and relentless mistreatment. Over 13,000 of them perished, their lives extinguished slowly in the heat of jungle labor camps, their suffering largely silent to the wider world. But the cruelties of war extended far beyond the battlefields of the Pacific. In the crumbling confines of Nazi-occupied Poland, a haunting photograph emerged during the 1943 Warsaw Ghetto uprising. A young Jewish boy, barely 10 years old, stood with hands raised, fear and innocence intermingled on his face, as German soldiers surrounded him. Dubbed the boy from the Warsaw Ghetto, his image transcended the moment of capture to become a timeless emblem of vulnerability, a symbol of an entire people subjected to systematic erasure. War, in its vast theater, plays many roles: destroyer, liberator, silencer, and revealer. Through aerial assaults, naval engagements, human suffering, and unspeakable endurance, the echoes of these moments ripple through time. Each photograph, each fallen plane, each lost child becomes a verse in a tragic yet necessary poem. One we must continue to read, not to glorify, but to remember. 4. Echoes of Shadows, a glimpse into the forgotten faces of World War II. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine the scent of scorched earth, the shriek of distant sirens, the muffled sobs in crumbling corridors of history. The Second World War was more than battles and borders. It was a symphony of human endurance, cruelty, courage, and devastation. Beyond the strategic maneuvers and towering headlines lies a collection of haunting moments, snapshots frozen in time that speak to the unspeakable pain and perseverance of individuals trapped in the gears of global conflict. As the Nazi regime tightened its grip across Europe, subtle acts of exclusion rapidly morphed into policies of annihilation. One morning in Vienna, the university's gates became a line in the sand. Say troops, with hands locked like a human chain, physically barred Jewish students from entering the institution, an act that symbolized the systematic exclusion of Jews from education, culture, and society. This scene wasn't isolated. It was a warning tremor before the full eruption of genocide. It foreshadowed the implementation of the Nuremberg laws, the burning of synagogues, the book bans, and the eventual transportation of innocent civilians to death camps under the guise of relocation. Far from European cities, in the skies over Germany, the air vibrated with tension and steel. The B-17 flying fortress named Wee Willie became legend not for its survival, but for its fall. Struck by the piercing precision of 88mm anti-aircraft fire, the bomber lost a wing mid-flight, its spiraling descent a tragic ballet of fate and gravity. Targeting strategic military infrastructure north of Berlin, its mission was part of a relentless campaign to cripple the German war machine. But for the crew aboard, the final moments spoke of sacrifice rather than strategy. War's cruelty knew no boundaries. In the steaming jungles and isolated prison camps of Southeast Asia, captured Allied soldiers endured horrors few would live to recount. Japanese military forces, operating under the infamous Bushido Code twisted by fanaticism, subjected prisoners of war to inhumane treatment. Forced marches, starvation, and beatings were routine. Some POWs were used as human guinea pigs, or even live bayonet practice. Others simply vanished. Execution was swift, often ceremonial, and always brutal. From the Pacific to the heart of Japan, the power of modern warfare culminated in a blinding flash above Nagasaki. An aerial view of the city before and after the atomic bomb dropped on August 9, 1945, reveals the scale of devastation. A fireball nearly 300 meters wide incinerated the landscape, flattening structures and burning thousands alive. In just moments, over 74,000 souls were extinguished, and countless more were marked by the invisible scars of radiation. The act, though justified as a means to end the war swiftly, remains one of history's most debated and haunting decisions. Back in April 1942, retaliation took a different form. The Doolittle Raid, America's daring airborne assault on Tokyo, saw B-25B bombers precariously lined up on the deck of the USS Hornet. These planes, never designed for carrier takeoff, had been specially modified for the mission. Their departure into the unknown carried both strategic and psychological weight, a message that Japan's mainland was no longer untouchable. Meanwhile, in the sunburned deserts of North Africa, RAF armorers loaded unfused bombs into aircraft bound for Italian positions. These missions, aimed at cutting Axis supply lines and supporting ground troops, formed a crucial part of the Allied strategy to seize control of the Mediterranean. The region, often overshadowed by the drama of Normandy or Stalingrad, was a chessboard of nations, where every bomb and bullet carried enormous stakes. Even in the desolate Aleutian Islands, war left behind stories of shared humanity. After the Allied landing on Kiska, in 1943, a gravestone carved by Japanese soldiers honored a fallen American pilot with the inscription, "Here sleeps a brave air hero who lost his youth and happiness for his homeland." Amid the cruelty of global conflict, this quiet act of reverence defied propaganda and reminded the world that respect for the dead transcends even the most bitter enmity. And in the frigid night skies above the Eastern Front, the night witches, Soviet women pilots, glided silently in wooden planes over enemy lines. Defying stereotypes and risking death on every mission, they completed over 23,000 sorties, dropping more than 3,000 tons of bombs. Their engines were cut before approaching their targets, allowing them to descend like phantoms, an eerie whisper of revenge in the night air. These fragments of history are not just tales of war. They are mirrors reflecting the soul of humanity at its most raw and revealing. 5. Glimpses of war. Ordinary lives amid extraordinary destruction. World War II was one of the most devastating conflicts in human history, affecting the lives of millions across continents. Behind the headlines of battles and strategies, it was everyday people, women, children, soldiers, and civilians, who endured the war's harshest realities. From bombed-out cities to snow-covered battlefields, their stories reflect the tragedy, resilience, and complexity of life during wartime. This collection of scenes offers a window into the personal side of World War II, focusing on how regular people were caught in the storm of global conflict. On the outskirts of Coventry, England, women walk carefully through the remains of what were once neighborhoods. The Luftwaffe bombings left the city in ruins, turning homes, schools, and even the famous medieval cathedral into rubble. For those who lived there, every morning meant waking up to a new scar on the landscape, and every night brought the fear of more bombs. In a small French town around 1944, fire rages through the streets. A woman is seen running as German troops retreat, leaving flames in their wake. This scorched earth tactic was meant to destroy anything useful to advancing Allied forces. But for local residents, it meant the loss of their homes, memories, and safety, all consumed by fire in mere hours. Further east in Nazi-occupied Ukraine, the horrors deepen. A group of Jewish people stands in silence, ordered to prepare for execution. These were not isolated incidents. More than 1 million Jews were killed in similar mass shootings, orchestrated by the Nazi Einsatzgruppen and often aided by local collaborators. These tragedies happened in forests, ravines, and open fields, places that became mass graves. Meanwhile, on the frozen front near Leningrad in 1943, 2 Soviet snipers move cautiously through the snow. Wearing camouflage and carrying rifles, they blend into the icy terrain. Their mission is to protect key locations and halt the enemy's advance. The siege of Leningrad lasted nearly 900 days, bringing hunger, cold, and unrelenting danger to soldiers and civilians alike. In the middle of this war, symbols became tools of control and terror. Around 1942, Jewish prisoners stand in rows, marked by yellow triangles on their uniforms. Other colors, red, green, pink, and purple, identified political opponents, criminals, homosexuals, and persecuted religious minorities. These visual codes stripped people of their identities, reducing them to categories in the eyes of their oppressors. London, too, bore the marks of war. Over the course of 8 months, relentless air raids, called the Blitz, destroyed or damaged more than 1 million homes. At the height of the bombings, the city endured up to 200 attacks in a single night. Families took shelter in subway stations, hoping that the underground would shield them from the falling fire above. After the war, justice was pursued. During the Nuremberg trials, Nazi leaders faced charges for war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. Some defendants laughed in the courtroom, unmoved by the evidence. Of the 24 main leaders on trial, 12 were sentenced to death. The trials set a historic precedent for holding individuals accountable for mass atrocities. In a more unusual wartime image, circus elephants like Kiri helped clear wreckage in Hamburg. With few machines available, these animals became part of the cleanup effort, helping civilians rebuild amid the ruins. War's beginning and end also left deep impressions. A newspaper vendor in London holds up a headline announcing the outbreak of war in 1939, when Germany invaded Poland. Just 6 years later, in 1945, American soldiers were liberated from a prisoner of war camp near Yokohama, Japan, finally freed from years of captivity. In the early days of Nazi occupation in cities like Kovel, Jews were forced to ride at the back of streetcars, and signs in German and Polish enforced this discrimination. Even in routine activities, oppression was everywhere. At Buchenwald concentration camp, prisoners line up for roll call under brutal conditions. Despite the suffering, some manage to form resistance groups, refusing to let their spirit be broken. These snapshots from history remind us not just of destruction, but also of human endurance and the will to survive, even in the darkest of times. 6. Echoes of War, a tapestry of human struggle and resilience in WWII. In the waning months of World War II, a haunting mark was left on HMS Sussex by a kamikaze pilot, one of many young Japanese aviators revered in Japan as martyrs. These men willingly undertook fatal missions, believing their sacrifice was a final act of honor in defense of a homeland under siege. That same desperation was evident when a kamikaze plane smashed into the deck of the USS Saratoga, killing crew and crippling the ship. These moments highlighted the extreme tactics Japan resorted to as Allied forces closed in, their losses mounting and hope dwindling. Far from the Pacific, in Amsterdam's Dam Square on May 7, 1945, 2 days after Germany's official surrender, civilians celebrating the war's end were caught in sudden chaos. German naval forces opened fire into the crowd, killing up to 32 innocent people. The square, once brimming with jubilation, became a place of terror, a stark reminder that violence did not always cease with peace agreements. Elsewhere, a photograph captures the innocent smile of Istvan Reiner, a 4-year-old Jewish boy taken before his deportation to Auschwitz. He was one of over 230,000 children sent to that notorious camp. Few survived. The Holocaust's mechanized cruelty, epitomized by places like Auschwitz and Belzec, targeted children, families, and communities, erasing generations in silence and ash. In a snapshot of sheer brutality, a Japanese cave complex on Iwo Jima is blown apart by U.S. Marines using flamethrowers, devices capable of projecting fire over 65 feet. Japanese defenders, entrenched in intricate tunnel systems, turned the island into a fortress of death. Meanwhile, on the same island, Marines huddled behind rocks as they detonated explosives to collapse enemy strongholds. The Pacific War was not just about islands. It was a war of attrition waged foot by foot through volcanic rock and smoke. In 1941, the German Wehrmacht surged into Soviet territory under Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in history. Over 3 million Axis troops clashed with the Red Army, and by the early months, 5 million Soviet soldiers had been captured. In these violent encounters, bunkers changed hands rapidly, and survival became a grim lottery. One image shows German soldiers advancing toward a Soviet trench, while another captures the devastating aftermath of an American firebombing over Tokyo in March 1945. That single raid dropped more than 1,500 tons of incendiaries, killing nearly 100,000 civilians and leveling half the city. Japan's cities, once vibrant and proud, were turned to ruin. In contrast to destruction, moments of humanity flickered. A German soldier is seen sharing bread with a starving Russian POW and his daughter. In a world overrun by cruelty, such an act symbolized a stubborn resilience of empathy, a gesture defying war's dehumanizing grip. The skies of Europe were equally contested. British Avro Lancaster bombers took part in Operation Mana in 1945, dropping life-saving food supplies to starving Dutch civilians. Waves of aircraft flew over smiling citizens who waved from rooftops, scenes of hope stitched into the final act of a war that had brought widespread hunger to the Netherlands. Waffen-SS soldiers are seen hauling artillery shells in a last-ditch attempt to resist Allied advances. Known for their fanatical loyalty to Hitler and involvement in atrocities, these units fought bitterly in places like Hungary and the Ardennes, where war's end only fueled their desperation. Scenes from concentration camps after liberation reveal the extent of Nazi horror. Emaciated prisoners emerged from places like Buchenwald and Dachau in May 1945, their freedom a beginning of an almost impossible recovery, both physical and emotional. Even as gates opened, the trauma remained shackled within. In Norway, RAF bombers targeted German warships off the coast of Heligoland in December 1939. These early missions marked Britain's commitment to air power, even before full-scale bombing campaigns began. As Europe braced for war's climax, British tanks rolled into Egyptian ports in 1940, bracing for combat in North Africa, where Rommel's Africa Corps threatened strategic strongholds like the Suez Canal. In the Philippines, U.S. landing craft approached Ladies' Beaches in October 1944 as aerial dogfights erupted overhead. The battle marked a turning point in the Pacific Campaign and signaled the return of Allied forces to retake the islands from Japanese control. From Berlin in 1933, Hitler's ideological war began with the public burning of books by Freud, Marx, and other intellectuals deemed subversive. That same year, he justified the invasion of Poland at the Kroll Opera House, citing fabricated threats to German minorities. This was not merely a war of territory, it was a battle of ideas, of history, rewritten by fire and blood. In Minsk, a chilling photograph captures Heinrich Himmler gazing at a Soviet child imprisoned in a concentration camp. The image is haunting, representing tyranny met by innocent defiance. Across France, as the Nazi occupation ended, women accused of fraternizing with German soldiers were publicly humiliated, their heads shaved in a raw expression of national trauma and vengeance. In Chongqing, Chinese troops used acoustic detectors to locate incoming Japanese aircraft. These mechanical ears helped guide anti-aircraft fire during brutal bombing campaigns, aimed at destabilizing China's wartime capital. War reached even the quiet corners of children's lives, evidenced in Warsaw, where a young girl weeps beside her sister's lifeless body following a bombing raid. In the Trondheim forest near Oslo, Norwegian traitor Vidkun Quisling stood before a mass grave of executed resistance fighters. Tried and executed in 1945, he became synonymous with betrayal. As the Nazi regime collapsed, their desperation turned toward children. The Hitler Youth, some as young as 16, were awarded medals and sent to defend Berlin with makeshift weapons against seasoned Allied forces. Meanwhile, scenes from the Blitz in London revealed a different kind of resilience. Bombed buildings, destroyed homes, and crowded underground shelters formed the nightly rhythm of survival. The monarchy stood with its people as King George VI and Winston Churchill inspected damage to Buckingham Palace, reinforcing morale during the capital's darkest hours. On the Eastern Front, a Russian soldier braces in a trench as a T-34 tank roars overhead during the Battle of Kursk, the largest tank battle in history. Nearly 6,000 armored vehicles clashed in this apocalyptic encounter, signaling the ultimate failure of German offensives in the East. As American troops advanced into Waldenburg in April 1945, cities crumbled under the weight of final resistance. Buchenwald's liberated prisoners displayed execution ropes once used against them, symbols of survival carved from the machinery of death. In the Battle of the Bulge, over 300 Allied prisoners were massacred by German troops after surrendering, clear violations of the Geneva Convention that underscored the war's moral collapse. In Hiroshima, the outline of a man's shadow remains burned into stone, left by the searing thermal flash of the atomic bomb. Survivors like Jinpei Terayama bore lifelong scars, physical and psychological testaments to the bomb's destructive legacy. Japanese Americans were interned by the U.S. government after Pearl Harbor, forced from their homes into guarded camps. Over 120,000 citizens lived behind fences, their loyalty questioned based solely on ethnicity. In the streets, propaganda posters urged food rationing with slogans like "food is a weapon," reflecting the total mobilization of society toward victory. And through it all, people remembered. In towns across Europe, memorials were built and prayers offered in silence. For neighbors who never returned, for children taken in the night, for cities rebuilt stone by stone. The wreckage of orphanages, the sobs of the young, and the resilience of the old form a mosaic of sorrow and hope. The Second World War did not simply end. It echoed. Through photographs, ruins, and memories, it continues to remind us of humanity's worst instincts and its fiercest compassion. 7. The Shadows of War, a global struggle etched in memory. In the summer of 1940, following the collapse of France under the weight of the German Blitzkrieg, Nazi troops marched triumphantly down the Avenue des Champs-Élysées in Paris. The occupation that ensued would plunge France into one of its darkest chapters, characterized by the iron grip of German military control, widespread arrests, suppression of resistance, and the collaboration of segments of the local population. Paris, once a beacon of freedom and culture, became a centerpiece of Nazi power in Western Europe. Across the Atlantic and deep in the Pacific theater, the relentless march of war took its toll on Allied soldiers. In the brutal conflict known as the Battle of Peleliu in 1944, an American Marine, visibly drained and physically broken, sat among the wreckage. The fighting, which extended over 2 grueling months, saw extreme temperatures, rugged terrain, and a fiercely determined enemy. The battle, though lesser known than others in the Pacific Campaign, resulted in staggering losses, over 12,000 American casualties, raising questions about its strategic necessity. Back in Europe, as the conflict ignited in 1939 with Germany's invasion of Poland, citizens in Moscow gathered solemnly to hear the official declaration of war. Germany's aggressive expansion prompted Britain and France to respond with declarations of their own, setting in motion a chain of events that would engulf nearly every corner of the globe. What began as regional aggression quickly escalated into a world war that redefined international relations, alliances, and the boundaries of human suffering. The Russian city of Murmansk, located in the northwest, bore the brunt of intense German bombing on June 18, 1942, a day remembered as one of the city's darkest. The attack, marked by waves of incendiary devices, left much of the town in ashes. Approximately 90% of Murmansk's old infrastructure was obliterated, forcing survivors to rebuild their lives amidst ruins under constant threat of renewed assault. Farther south, in the Bavarian city of Nuremberg, Allied air raids laid waste to the city center. Known as a symbolic stronghold of the Nazi Party and the site of mass rallies, Nuremberg was relentlessly targeted. By the end of the bombings, the heart of this historic city had been reduced to a smoldering landscape of twisted iron and crumbling stone, echoing the collapse of the ideology it had once helped foster. On the front lines, captured Soviet soldiers endured brutal interrogations at the hands of the German military. These sessions, often involving torture, were intended to extract strategic intelligence. The dehumanizing conditions of such treatment underscored the grim reality of war, a struggle not only of armies, but of ideologies and atrocities. In Berlin, 1941, a crowd raised their arms in unison, saluting Adolf Hitler during a rally that reflected the widespread support Nazism still held in parts of Germany. Early in the regime's rise, promises of national revival, employment, and restored pride swayed many to embrace its cause. Propaganda played a crucial role in shaping public perception, masking the brutalities that were to come under the totalitarian rule. Within the grim confines of the Flossenbürg concentration camp in Bavaria, around 1940, detainees were subjected to relentless forced labor. Granite quarries, vital for the Nazi building program, became sites of daily torment where exhaustion, injury, and death were common. These camps were not only mechanisms of political repression, but also tools of economic exploitation, turning human suffering into industrial output. Thousands of miles away in the Philippines, the surrender of Allied forces at Bataan in 1942 led to one of the war's most infamous episodes, the Bataan Death March. Roughly 76,000 American and Filipino troops were forced to march over 60 miles in unforgiving heat, denied food and water. Many perished along the way, succumbing to starvation, beatings, or execution by their Japanese captors. Despite the age of mechanized warfare, traditional elements like horse cavalry still played roles in certain theaters, particularly in North Africa. The challenging desert terrain rendered tanks and trucks unreliable, making mounted units a necessary adaptation. A photograph from the period captures the odd juxtaposition. Modern soldiers relying on ancient means of transportation in an era dominated by steel and fire. In South London, the impact of war was felt on a domestic front. A butcher, removing a coupon from a customer's ration book, represented the structured system of food distribution Britain adopted during the conflict. With imports disrupted by U-boat attacks, rationing was essential to ensure equitable access to scarce resources. For many families, ration books were lifelines amidst scarcity. The Pacific island of Saipan saw chaotic scenes in 1944 as American forces advanced. Japanese civilians, caught between retreating soldiers and incoming bombardments, fled through clouds of smoke from grenades. The battle was not just a military confrontation, but a humanitarian disaster, with thousands of civilians facing death or forced displacement. In 1941, London endured the Blitz. Sustained bombings by the German Luftwaffe. The city's skyline was transformed by fire and ruin as firefighters worked round the clock to extinguish flames that devoured entire neighborhoods. Civilians sought shelter underground, in subway tunnels or reinforced basements, enduring the terrifying nights with grim resolve. During this time, St. Peter's School in London posted notices on its barbed wire fences, informing parents of meetings about air raid precautions. Education institutions became centers of civilian defense, organizing evacuations, training sessions, and the construction of shelters to protect children from the daily threat of bombs. Meanwhile, in occupied Poland, German soldiers began systematic searches of Jewish neighborhoods in September 1939. Ostensibly to confiscate weapons, these operations were part of the broader Nazi strategy to isolate, disarm, and eventually annihilate Jewish communities. These early acts marked the chilling beginnings of the Holocaust. In East London, the human cost of war was tragically visible. Children displaced by bombings sat among the ruins of their homes, their lives irreversibly altered. Over 750,000 Londoners lost their homes during the Blitz, with many forced to seek refuge in improvised shelters or leave the city altogether in mass evacuations. By April 1945, the war in Europe approached its final act. In Berlin, as Soviet forces closed in, a weary German soldier slumped in front of the burning Reichstag, once a symbol of imperial and Nazi power. The city, subjected to relentless artillery fire and urban combat, lay in ruins. This scene marked the dying gasp of the Third Reich. In Japan, August 1945 brought an abrupt and emotional end to the conflict. After the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the Soviet Union's declaration of war, Emperor Hirohito addressed his nation via radio. Civilians wept as they listened to the surrender announcement, an event that ended years of devastation but also initiated a profound national reckoning. Back in 1941, British soldiers trained for scenarios involving chemical warfare. Wearing gas masks and carrying bayonets, they advanced through clouds of simulated gas. Memories of World War I's chemical horrors lingered, and preparedness remained vital, even if such weapons were not widely used in the Second World War. In the British territory of Gibraltar, monkeys were more than a curiosity. They were omens. A popular legend warned that if the monkeys ever disappeared, Gibraltar would fall from British hands. Winston Churchill, valuing symbolism and morale, ensured that the population of primates was sustained, blending superstition with strategy in the island's defense. As cities across Germany were reduced to rubble by Allied air raids, survivors scrawled their new addresses on the walls of bombed-out buildings. These impromptu messages became lifelines in the shattered urban landscape, helping families reconnect amid chaos. The return of German soldiers to Paris in 1940, parading beneath the Arc de Triomphe, was a symbol of Nazi dominance. Paris, though spared the destruction of other cities, became a linchpin in the German occupation of France, serving as a strategic and symbolic prize. The city's fall and subjugation marked a critical moment in the Nazi expansion across Europe. 8. Echoes of War, a journey through the Second World War in images and moments. World War II, a conflict of unparalleled scale and suffering unfolded across continents, leaving a trail of ruin, resilience, and revelation. Its battlefields spanned from the dense jungles of Southeast Asia to the bombed-out cities of Europe, and its impact was etched into the lives of millions. Through a sequence of vivid and haunting moments, we trace this global struggle, not merely through strategies and statistics, but through the eyes of those who endured it. In 1943, Chinese soldiers pushed forward to the Salween front, launching a critical campaign through the treacherous terrain of Burma. Their objective: to break the Japanese blockade and reopen the Burma Road, a vital lifeline for Allied supplies to China. It was a feat of logistical and human endurance, one that symbolized China's tenacity in the face of encroaching imperial forces. By September 1944, far from the jungles of Burma, American troops were surging through Western Europe. A German officer, captured during these rapid advances, stood as a living emblem of a faltering regime. The Allies liberated city after city, forcing German troops to retreat beyond the Rhine. Each step forward marked both victory and the mounting toll of war. In Warsaw, Poland, the scars of conflict ran deep. After a relentless siege in 1939, the city lay in ruins. Over weeks of brutal bombardment, German forces reduced the urban landscape to rubble, killing thousands and compelling Poland's surrender. By war's end, nearly 85% of Warsaw's infrastructure was obliterated. To the east, the German army battled not only the Soviet Red Army, but also the unyielding Russian environment. In the fall of 1943, their advance across the muddy terrain of Nevel slowed to a crawl. Vehicles sank, boots stuck fast in muck, and the front lines turned into quagmires. Nature itself seemed to resist the invader. In the Pacific, 1945 saw the endgame of Japan's empire. On Okinawa, 7,400 Japanese soldiers, gaunt and hollow-eyed, marched into captivity. Astonishing given the culture of death over surrender prevalent among imperial troops. Yet hunger, fatigue, and futility finally broke their resolve. Autumn 1942 brought one of the war's most harrowing battles, Stalingrad. Soviet troops clawed their way through streets lined with the wreckage of civilization. Every building became a fortress, every block a battlefield. The confrontation, involving over 2 million soldiers, signaled the slow but inevitable retreat of Hitler's eastern ambitions. Meanwhile, in Leningrad, life itself was a siege. For nearly 900 days, the city endured German encirclement. Citizens braved shelling, starvation, and freezing temperatures. In winter 1942, desperate residents gathered water from ruptured pipes, often under falling bombs. Over 1 million lives were lost, but the city held. In Czechoslovakia, the village of Lidice was razed in 1942 following the assassination of Reinhard Heydrich, one of the Holocaust's chief architects. Every man was executed. Women and children faced deportation, death, or forced assimilation. It was a brutal act of retribution that still echoes in memorial silence. Spring floods in Russia brought a cruel irony after winter's freeze. Melting snows turned roads into rivers, stalling German armor. Soldiers, soaked and freezing, trudged through icy waters, victims of both war and weather. In the Philippines, April 1942 saw American soldiers on the Bataan Peninsula fighting without adequate supplies. One such soldier, clutching a Molotov cocktail, symbolized the grit and desperation of a campaign marked by starvation, exhaustion, and ultimate surrender. Across the Egyptian desert in 1941, Australian light cavalry squads drove their fast, lightweight gun carriers in preparation for the North African campaign. These agile forces were pivotal in harassing Axis supply lines and engaging in rapid strikes under blistering sun. In the skies of the Middle East, British Hurricane fighter planes soared into combat in December 1940. Reliable and deadly, these aircraft secured vital air superiority in the desert, fending off Italian and German threats with calculated aggression. In Greece, SS troops marked their boats with swastikas to prevent friendly fire as they crossed the Gulf of Corinth during the Balkans campaign. It was an eerie image, emblems of hatred sailing toward conquest. On January nights in 1941, London burned under the Blitz. From atop St. Paul's Cathedral, flames painted the sky, illuminating shattered neighborhoods. Yet amid the inferno, landmarks like the Old Bailey Tower stood tall, a stubborn defiance to fear. In California, Jimmy Stewart, beloved Hollywood actor, took an oath as a second lieutenant in the U.S. Army Air Corps. Known for his screen presence, Stewart became a bomber pilot, flying dangerous missions over Europe with distinction. Also in January 1941, atop the Empire State Building, observers participated in air defense tests. With the looming threat of Axis bombers, the program monitored 18,000 square miles of northeastern airspace, an eerie prelude to the attack on Pearl Harbor. Back in San Francisco, 17 tons of propaganda from Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, Imperial Japan, and the Soviet Union were burned by postal workers. It was a symbolic stand against foreign influence, but also a stark reflection of the growing climate of suspicion. In Warsaw, a wall rose. Built by the Nazis, it enclosed over 500,000 Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto. Inside, a German officer once lectured children about hygiene, a cruel irony as residents suffered disease, starvation, and overcrowding under brutal repression. In August 1940, Japanese bombers ravaged Chongqing, China. Amid the wreckage, a young water carrier continued his work, embodying quiet defiance in the face of destruction. During the Battle of Midway, sailors on the USS Yorktown assessed damage as the carrier listed. Despite heroic repair efforts, the ship was hit again by torpedoes and ultimately sank, taking with it a chapter of naval resilience. In the war's final days, American pilots flew over Hitler's mountain retreat in Berchtesgaden. Bombing craters pockmarked the terrain as Allied forces symbolically obliterated the last vestiges of the Third Reich's illusion. In post-war Tokyo, decommissioned buses lined the streets, converted into makeshift homes by displaced civilians. With over 1 million buildings destroyed, survivors clung to shelter wherever they could. In Naples, an Italian woman kissed a U.S. soldier's hand on October 10, 1943. It was a moment of spontaneous gratitude, as liberation from fascist rule brought both joy and uncertainty. Allied bombings flattened Cologne. A B-24 Liberator flew above the ruins, with the city's famous cathedral, battered but still standing, rising from the ashes like a solemn monument to endurance. From a French hillside in July 1944, 2 children watched Allied convoys rumble toward Saint-Lô. Once a town, now a field of rubble, Saint-Lô stood as a symbol of the cost of liberation. In Stalingrad's icy death grip, German soldiers, unprepared for the winter, fashioned straw shoes and draped themselves in blankets, desperately clinging to warmth in a frozen hell. As German forces retreated from the Netherlands in 1945, they flooded vast areas by breaching dikes. In Kranenburg, workers labored in chest-deep water to repair communication lines. efforts to restore order amid chaos. A 16-year-old German boy captured in 1945 wore a face drained of youth. Pressed into service during the Reich's collapse, many such boys found themselves on battlefields they scarcely understood. In Münster, American troops pushed through flames and ruin, pressing ever deeper into Nazi Germany. Cities burned, but momentum never ceased. Over the USS Essex, a kamikaze plane, trailing smoke, dived with grim purpose. It was November 1944, and Japan's last gambits played out in suicide missions, a tragic testament to fanatical desperation. In London, the silhouette of the Palace of Westminster stood against the fiery glow of the Blitz. Despite repeated attacks, Parliament endured, symbolizing the United Kingdom's unbroken resolve. In Okinawa's capital, Naha, a Marine peered from a crater in a destroyed theater. The city, once teeming with nearly 500,000 people, was now a ghost of rubble and smoke. In southern Italy, German infantry crouched in ambush as Stuka dive bombers screamed overhead. The Italian campaign was grinding, marked by tough terrain, heavy losses, and unyielding defenders. In 1940, British troops at Dunkirk watched skies torn by bombers as they waited for evacuation. Operation Dynamo, fraught with peril, saved hundreds of thousands from encirclement, an act of logistical brilliance under fire. Captured Soviet soldiers marched and surrendered during the early days of Operation Barbarossa in 1941. By July 2nd, hundreds of thousands had fallen into German hands, signaling a brutal start to a horrific campaign. In Leningrad's suburbs, Soviet civilians torched their own homes, enacting a scorched earth policy to deny the Germans any use of local resources. It was a grim act of sacrifice. From Minsk, a father held his son while his wife, hollow-eyed and weary, collapsed on the pavement. The family, like thousands, fled devastation, trying to escape the horrors of occupation. Finnish troops in 1941 stormed Soviet bunkers to reclaim lost lands during the continuation war. Their battles were fierce, their motivations deeply tied to past injustices. In the Wauer Forest of Germany, American artillery crews fired 105mm howitzers through dense foliage. The thunder of these weapons paved the way across the Rhine in late 1944. Canadian forces, after liberating Rousseau-Saint-Pierre in July 1944, patrolled streets now eerily quiet. Their discipline and bravery marked them as a standout Allied force. In mop-up operations on Iwo Jima, 3 emaciated Japanese soldiers surrendered at last. Weakened by starvation, they stepped from their caves into uncertain captivity. A soccer match between Arsenal and Carlton Athletic continued under the ominous drone of air raids. In 1940, Britain football became a quiet rebellion, proof that life could go on, even during war. The city of Düren lay in ruins after daylight bombings in 1945. Every building gone, its 22,000 residents had been evacuated before the storm, a ghost city left to smolder. In Strasbourg, a U.S. 7th Army soldier operated an M1 mortar along a railway track, targeting hidden enemies with precision and resolve. In Auschwitz, a pile of prosthetic limbs testified to the genocide's horror. Each belonged to a person robbed not just of mobility, but of life. A final, silent monument to the unspeakable cruelty that the war exposed. In the shadowed folds of history, where gunfire met silence and hope clung to the salt-stung winds, stories of unimaginable courage unfolded. Stories etched not in monuments, but in the tremble of waves and the grit of soil. It was May 1940 when British and French troops, their backs to the sea, stood breathless on the sands of Dunkirk. Encircled by German forces, what seemed like certain annihilation became a miracle. Operation Dynamo, a desperate orchestration of naval might and civilian bravery, pulled 338,000 souls from the grasp of defeat, their salvation carried by yachts, lifeboats, and repurposed fishing vessels. Thousands of miles away, aboard the deck of the USS Enterprise, the metallic click of wings unfolding marked the beginning of destiny. Torpedo bombers, engines growling, took flight into the blue toward the heart of the Japanese fleet. The Battle of Midway, June 1942, was not just a clash of firepower, but a turning point. It shattered Japan's naval supremacy and breathed new determination into the American war machine. Yet while some soared into glory, others were herded like shadows. In the choking summer heat of 1944, Warsaw, Jews were crammed into open cattle cars, their destination whispered only in the breathless silence of despair. Bound for extermination camps, many never survived the brutal journey. And when the Warsaw Ghetto rose in a final defiant blaze in 1943, German fury turned it into smoldering ash, a graveyard without names. Elsewhere, in the shark-haunted waters off Australia, the HMS Armidale slipped beneath the waves in 1942. For days, survivors clung to life, drifting beneath a merciless sun. A reconnaissance pilot, slicing through the clouds, spotted them and summoned help. 49 were saved. Others were claimed by the sea. On the bloodied soil of the Philippines, American and Filipino soldiers huddled in foxholes during the Battle of Bataan. Surrounded, starved, and outgunned, they fought with what little they had, until surrender brought no mercy. Instead came the infamous Death March, a 62-mile trek of torment. Those who collapsed were silenced by the butt of a rifle. Across Europe, the war wrote new rituals. In Normandy, a fallen soldier's friend knelt in the mud and pressed a makeshift cross into the earth. The grave bore no marble, only memory. In Smolensk, Soviet determination clawed the city back from German hands in 1943, but not without a price. Scorched earth, shattered lives, and charred dreams. Sometimes resistance came with a melody. In 1943, famed singer Edith Piaf entered a Nazi POW camp under the guise of performance. Her songs wrapped the air in longing, but within her photos were forged documents, keys to freedom for a few lucky prisoners. And in occupied France, as a French resistance fighter stared down a German firing squad, he smiled, not in surrender, but in defiance. He knew that every act of sabotage whispered a message: freedom lives. Even the ancient stones of Monte Cassino were not spared. Founded in the 6th century, the monastery fell under the relentless bombing of Allied forces. The cost was high, the path uncertain, but each crumbled wall spoke of resolve. These are not just moments in time. They are echoes of fear, of valor, of resilience, echoes that, if you listen closely, still whisper in the wind.